Elias Jackson sat in the dim, grimy holding cell of the San Diego precinct, the air thick with mildew and the sour tang of sweat. Shadows danced across the cracked concrete walls as a single bulb flickered overhead, buzzing like a trapped fly. His wrists ached from the cuffs that had bitten into his skin just an hour ago, a dull throb pulsing where officers Travis Holt and Miles Decker had twisted them tight enough to bruise. Blood crusted on his lower lip, a bitter reminder of the fist that had smashed into his face when he dared to speak on the pier. He leaned against the cold bench, posture straight despite the pain, his grey eyes sharp and unyielding, watching the two cops through the bars as they strutted like roosters in a pen. Holt, wiry with a buzzed head and a perpetual sneer, leaned against the wall, twirling Elias's shredded ID between his fingers. Decker, broader, with a patchy beard and a lazy slouch, lounged nearby, picking at his nails with a pocket knife. "What's a dock rat like you even got ID for?" Holt sneered, his voice a jagged blade cutting through the quiet. He ripped the plastic card in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like dead leaves. Probably stole it off some poor bastard who didn't know better. Decker chuckled, a low guttural sound that rumbled in his chest, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement as he flicked the knife shut and tucked it into his belt. "Yeah, old man, you think you're somebody? Look at you now, sitting in our cage where you belong." Elias didn't flinch, his gaze steady as a rock in a storm, the kind of calm that came from decades of facing men just like these, men who thought power was a birthright and skin color a verdict. "I'd like my phone call," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who knew his rights and wouldn't bend to their games. Holt's sneer twisted into a full grin, teeth flashing as he stepped closer to the bars, his boots scuffing the gritty floor. "Phone call? You hear that, Deck? This guy thinks he's got privileges." He laughed, sharp and mocking, then spat onto the concrete just inches from Elias's feet. "You don't get shit, old man. You're lucky we don't toss you in the bay with the rest of the trash." Decker straightened, cracking his knuckles as he joined Holt, his bulk filling the space like a wall of malice. "Yeah, keep your mouth shut, or we'll give you something to really cry about." Elias held their stares, unblinking, his lips pressing into a thin line as he swallowed the coppery taste in his mouth. He'd seen this before, the casual brutality, the glee in their eyes as they tore down anyone who didn't fit their narrow world. But he wasn't just anyone, and they were about to learn that the hard way. Outside, the night pulsed with a different energy. Across the street from the precinct, Malik Jackson, Elias's 26-year-old grandson, paced the sidewalk, his breath fogging in the cool air as fury burned in his chest. He'd been at the pier, snapping photos of the sunset for his activism blog, when he'd seen the cops drag his grandfather away. The sight of Elias, grey hair glinting under the streetlights, slammed to the ground like a common thief, had lit a fire in him that wouldn't die. His phone trembled in his hands as he typed a frantic post, calling his followers to rally. "They've got my granddad locked up for nothing," he muttered, voice tight as he hit send. Within minutes, a dozen people showed up, then 20, then 50, their voices rising in a chant that echoed off the precinct's brick facade. "Let him go! Let him go!" Signs waved high, scrawled with demands for justice, as car horns blared in solidarity from the road. Malik stood at the front, his lean frame tense, dreadlocks swinging as he shouted into a megaphone he'd borrowed from a friend. "This is about more than one man. This is about all of us." His words crackled with passion, a spark igniting the crowd's rage, but the precinct didn't stay quiet. Backup arrived fast, 6 more officers spilling out of vans, batons gleaming, under the sodium lights. They formed a line, faces hard as granite, and without warning a canister hissed, spewing pepper spray into the air. Malik coughed, eyes streaming as the stinging cloud hit, his megaphone clattering to the pavement. The crowd scattered, some screaming, others falling as the cops advanced, swinging clubs with practiced ease. A woman beside Malik crumpled, clutching, her face while a teenage boy was tackled, his skull cracking against the curb. Malik stumbled back, wiping his eyes, his heart hammering as he saw the chaos he'd unleashed. He'd wanted to help his granddad, not start a war, but now the war was here. Back inside, the noise filtered through the precinct's thick walls, a distant roar that made Holt's sneer falter for a split second. He glanced at Decker, irritation flashing in his pale blue eyes. What the hell's that racket? Decker shrugged, lumbering to a window and peering out, his thick fingers gripping the sill. Bunch of punks making a scene. Looks like they're pissed about something. Holt's grin returned, darker now, as he turned back to Elias, who sat, still as a statue, watching them with that unnerving calm. Your people out there crying for you, huh? Too bad they're just making it worse. He crossed the cell block in 3 quick strides, snatching Elias's phone from the evidence bag on a nearby table. The Supreme Court seal glinted under the dim light, but Holt didn't care to look closer. He raised the device high, then smashed it against the floor, the crack of shattering glass loud enough to make Decker flinch. Oops, Holt said, voice dripping with fake regret as he ground the pieces under his heel. Guess you tampered with evidence, old man. That's another charge for the books. Decker laughed, a deep bellow that shook his frame as he leaned against the bars, close enough for Elias to smell the stale coffee on his breath. You're stuck here now. No fancy call's gonna save you. Elias tilted his head, just a fraction, his grey eyes narrowing as he studied the wreckage of his phone. They thought they'd broken his lifeline, severed his way out. Fools. His mind clicked like a steel trap, numbers flashing behind his lids, a sequence he'd memorized years ago for moments just like this. You're digging a hole, he said, voice low and steady, a quiet promise woven into the words. Holt's grin faltered again, a flicker of unease crossing his sharp features, but he shook it off, stepping back with a scoff. Keep talking, Doc Rat. We'll see who's buried by morning. The cell block grew quiet again, the distant chants muffled by the walls, but the tension hung thick, a storm brewing in the stale air. Elias sat back, his bruised hands resting in his lap, his mind already racing ahead. He'd faced worse than this, stood toe-to-toe with men who'd wielded power like a club, and he'd outlasted them all. Holt and Decker thought they'd caged him, stripped him bare, but they didn't know the man they'd locked up. Out there, Malik coughed through the last of the pepper spray, picking up his megaphone with trembling hands, his resolve hardening. As he faced the line of cops, he'd fight for his granddad no matter the cost. Inside, Elias closed his eyes, the ghost of a smirk tugging at his split lip. They'd smashed his phone, sure, but they couldn't smash what he knew, who he could reach. One call, that's all it'd take, and this precinct, these cops, this whole rotten system would feel the ground shift beneath them. They thought they'd won this round, but they'd only lit the fuse. The real clash was coming, and Elias Jackson was ready to burn it all down. The precinct's phone booth smelled of rust and despair. A cramped metal coffin tucked in a corner of the cell block, where the air hung heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies and burnt coffee. Elias Jackson stood inside, his bruised hands steady, as he gripped the receiver, the cold plastic pressing against his ear. The flickering bulb overhead buzzed like a swarm of angry bees, casting jagged shadows across his weathered face, his grey eyes glinting with a fire that hadn't dimmed despite the blood still crusted on his lip. Officers Travis, Holt and Miles Decker lounged just outside, their boots scuffing the grimy floor, their smirks wide as they watched him through the scratched glass. Holt leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his wiry frame coiled with mockery, while Decker slouched nearby, his broad shoulders hunched, a toothpick rolling between his teeth. A half-dozen other cops milled around, their laughter a jagged chorus, bouncing off the concrete walls, each one eager to see the old black man squirm. Elias punched in the number from memory, each digit a silent vow, his fingers moving with the precision of a man who'd spent decades bending the law to justice. The line crackled, then connected, and a crisp voice answered, sharp as a gavel's crack. Chief Justice Reynolds, Olivia Reynolds, 58. His former clerk turned powerhouse sat in her D.C. office, the late hour forgotten, as she recognized the weight of silence on the other end. Olivia, Elias said, his voice smooth as river stones, unshaken by the chaos around him. It's me. A pause, then a sharp breath hissed through the receiver. Elias, where are you? Her tone shifted, alarm threading through her usual steel. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, letting the truth settle. San Diego precinct, locked up. 2 officers, Holt and Decker, didn't bother with my ID. Thought I was a vagrant. Olivia's voice hardened, a storm brewing in her words. They did what? You're a retired Supreme Court justice and they... I'm calling the DOJ now. This ends tonight. Elias's lips twitched, a flicker of satisfaction cutting through the pain in his jaw. But before he could respond, Holt's sneer sliced through the glass. Who you talking to, old man? Your imaginary lawyer? He banged on the booth, the sound a dull thud, his pale eyes glinting with disdain as he mocked the call. Hang it up, Doc Rat, ain't nobody coming for you. Elias kept his gaze on the receiver, but Holt wasn't done. He shoved the door open, his hand darting in to slam the phone down, cutting Olivia off mid-sentence. That's enough. Have your bullshit? Holt snarled, his breath hot with stale tobacco as he loomed over Elias, close enough for the old man to see the sweat beading on his forehead. Decker lumbered forward, chuckling as he grabbed Elias's arm, yanking him out with a force that made his shoulder pop. Back to your hole, Decker growled, his voice a low rumble, shoving Elias toward the cell with a rough push that sent him stumbling against the bars. The other cops jeered, a pack of hyenas circling a wounded lion, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of slurs and taunts. Look at him, thinking he's special, one shouted, while another tossed a crumpled soda can that clanged off, the metal near Elias's feet. He straightened, brushing off the shove like dust from his coat, his posture unbowed as he turned to face them. You're piling dirt on your own graves, he said, his tone steady, a quiet thunder rolling beneath. The words. Holt scoffed, stepping close, his finger jabbing the air an inch from Elias's chest. Keep dreaming, old man, that call was a bluff and you're still ours. Decker grinned, cracking his knuckles as he leaned in, his bulk blocking the warm, dim light. Yeah, nobody cares about some washed-up nobody crying in a booth. Elias met their stares, his grey eyes cutting through their bravado like a blade through fog, but he said nothing more, letting their laughter echo as they slammed. The cell door shut. Outside, the night had erupted into chaos. Malik Jackson stood at the precinct's edge, his throat raw from shouting, his eyes still stinging from the pepper spray that clung to his skin like a bitter memory. The crowd had swelled to over 100, their voices a tidal wave crashing against the precinct's walls, signs bobbing above their heads with messages scrawled in thick marker. Free Elias now. And end the hate. Malik's phone buzzed non-stop, his live stream racking up thousands of views as strangers joined the chant from their screens. They've got my granddad in there for no reason, he yelled into the camera, his dreadlocks swinging as he paced, his lean frame taut with fury. This is what they do to us. The air pulsed with defiance, but the cops weren't backing down. More vans screeched to a halt, disgorging officers in riot gear, their shields glinting under the streetlights like polished armor. Disperse, or face arrest, a bullhorn blared, the voice cold and mechanical, but the crowd roared back undeterred. Then the kettling began. Cops closed in from both sides, trapping the protesters in a shrinking circle, batons raised high. Malik ducked as a club swung past his head, the wind of it brushing his ear, his heart pounding as he saw a woman beside him crumple, her sign snapping under a boot. Back off, he shouted, shoving forward, but a wall of shields pushed him, back, pinning the crowd tight. Sirens wailed as dozens were zip-tied, dragged to paddy wagons, their screams swallowed by the night. Malik's phone slipped, the live stream cutting to black, but not before the world saw the precinct's iron fist. Inside, Holt's grin widened as he caught wind of the chaos outside, his radio crackling with updates from the riot squad. Your little fan club's getting crushed, he said, turning to Elias with a gleam in his eye. Guess they're as dumb as you are. He grabbed a clipboard from the desk, scribbling with a flourish as he spoke. Let's make this official. Vandalism, huh? Scratched up my squad car when we nabbed you. That's what the report'll say. Decker nodded, his toothpick snapping between his teeth as he added, Yeah, saw it myself. Clear as day. The lie slid out smooth as oil, a fresh chain to wrap around Elias's neck, and the other cop snickered, nodding along like it was gospel. Elias sat on the bench, his hands resting in his lap, his face a mask of calm as he watched them weave their web. They thought they'd buried him deeper, tightened the noose with every fabricated word. But then a shadow moved near the cell block door, a rookie cop, barely 22, his uniform crisp and his eyes wide with something like fear. He edged closer, glancing over his shoulder as Holt and Decker turned away, distracted by their own laughter. The rookie slipped a small burner phone through the bars, his whisper barely audible over the precinct's hum. "I know who you are," he said, voice trembling as he darted back into the shadows. Elias palmed the device, tucking it into his sleeve, his pulse steady as he felt the weight of a new lifeline. Holt and Decker thought they'd silenced him, crushed his hope under their boots, but they'd missed the spark. One call had shaken them, and another would break them. What did that rookie see that the others couldn't? Drop a 1 in the comments if you're raging at how Holt and Decker twisted the truth to bury Elias deeper, or a 2 if you think that rookie's got more guts than the rest. Smash that like button if you're rooting for Elias to turn the tables, and subscribe because tomorrow's twist will leave you speechless. Now tell me this, will that tiny phone in Elias's sleeve be enough to crack the precinct wide open? Or has he just grabbed a lifeline that's about to snap? The interrogation room in the San Diego precinct was a sterile box of despair, its walls a dull gray that seemed to leach color from the world, the air stale with the tang of disinfectant and fear. Elias Jackson sat at a scarred metal table, his wrists still raw from cuffs, his tailored coat torn at the shoulder where Decker had yanked him from the phone booth. A single bulb dangled above, its harsh light carving shadows into his bruised face, the blood on his lip now a dark scab against his weathered skin. His grey eyes burned with a quiet fury, unwavering as he clutched the burner phone the rookie had slipped him, its cheap plastic warm against his palm, hidden beneath the table's edge. Officers Travis Holt and Miles Decker stood across from him, their silhouettes menacing against the door, Holt's wiry frame taut with irritation, Decker's bulk a looming threat. Holt paced, his boots clicking on the concrete floor, while Decker cracked his knuckles, the sound a dull pop in the silence. "You think that little toy's gonna save you?" Holt sneered, his voice sharp as a switchblade, nodding at the faint bulge under Elias's sleeve. "Go ahead, make your call. Ain't nobody coming." Elias didn't blink, his fingers curling tighter around the phone as he dialed the number again, each press a silent rebellion. The line clicked, and Olivia Reynolds's voice cut through, crisp and urgent. "Elias, I've got the DOJ on this. They're sending an agent now. Hang tight." Her words were a lifeline, a promise of steel, but Holt's grin widened, his pale eyes glinting with malice as he leaned over the table, close enough for Elias to smell the sour sweat on him. "Too late, old man," he said, snatching the phone. Mid-sentence and smashing it against the wall, the crack of plastic echoing like a gunshot. Decker laughed, a deep rumble that shook his frame as he stepped forward, his meaty hand slamming Elias's shoulder. "Time to learn some manners." Before Elias could brace himself, Holt's fist crashed into his jaw, snapping his head to the side, a fresh burst of pain exploding through his skull. Blood welled in his mouth, hot and metallic, as Decker followed with a kick to his ribs, the force knocking him off the chair onto the cold floor. "That's for thinking you're better than us," Decker growled, his boot pressing into Elias's back, pinning him down as Holt loomed above, cracking his neck with a smirk. "Doc rat like you don't get to talk back." The beating was swift, brutal, a storm of fists and boots raining down, each blow a message carved in flesh. "You don't belong, you're nothing." Elias curled inward, protecting his head, his breath ragged but his spirit uncrushed, decades of resilience shielding him from breaking. He'd faced lynch mobs in his youth, stared down judges who'd spat in his face, and he wouldn't bow. Now, the rookie's words echoed in his mind. "I know who you are." A flicker of hope amid the pain as Holt and Decker stepped back, panting, their knuckles smeared with his blood. "That's enough for now," Holt said, wiping his hands, on his pants, his sneer returning as he hauled Elias back into the chair. "Let's see how tough you are when the charges stick." Decker nodded, pulling a small baggie of white powder from his pocket, the drugs glinting under the light as he tossed it onto the table. "Found this in your coat," he lied, his voice smooth as venom, planting the felony with a grin. "Possession. With intent. You're going down hard, old man." Elias spat blood onto the floor, his gaze locking onto theirs, a silent vow etched in his stare. They thought they'd buried him, but they'd only stoked the fire. Outside, the city churned with rage. Malik Jackson's livestream had exploded across the internet, the footage of cops kettling his protest, now viewed by millions, hashtags like "Justice for Elias" trending as the sun dipped below the horizon. The precinct's front steps swarmed with news vans, their satellite dishes spiking the skyline, reporters shouting into microphones about the elderly black man brutalized for standing still. Malik stood amid the chaos, his shirt stained with pepper spray, his voice hoarse as he spoke to a camera crew, dreadlocks swaying with each furious word. "They're framing my granddad. This ain't justice, it's war." His followers had doubled, their chants shaking the ground, but the response wasn't what he'd hoped. Mayor Harold Vance, a balding white man with a politician's smile and a Klansman's heart, stepped onto a podium downtown, his suit crisp despite the late hour, his voice booming through speakers. "These riots are a disgrace," he said, his tone dripping with false regret. "We're imposing a curfew to restore order. Law-abiding citizens deserve peace, not this chaos." The crowd booed, but Vance's eyes gleamed, his words a dog whistle to the city's ugliest corners. Behind closed doors, he'd already called the precinct, his orders sharp. "Keep that troublemaker locked up, whatever it takes." The curfew hit hard. Police barricades slicing through black neighborhoods, sirens wailing as families huddled indoors, fear replacing defiance. Malik clenched his fists, his phone buzzing with messages of support, but the mayor's move had choked their momentum, turning a movement into a target. Back in the interrogation room, the door banged open, and a new figure strode in, cutting through the haze of violence like a blade through smoke. DOJ agent Carla Ortiz, 41, her dark hair pulled tight, her badge glinting on her belt, stood with an authority that made Holt and Decker freeze. Her brown eyes swept the scene, narrowing at the blood on Elias's face, the baggie on the table, the smug grins on the cops' faces. "Elias Jackson?" she said, her voice clipped, professional but laced with a fury she barely restrained. "I'm here on behalf of the Department of Justice. You're released effective immediately." Elias pushed himself up, wincing as his ribs screamed, his grey eyes meeting hers with a nod of recognition. Freedom, at last. Holt's sneer faltered, his hands balling into fists as he stepped forward. "Hold up, lady. He's got pending charges, drugs, vandalism, you name it." Ortiz didn't flinch, pulling a tablet from her bag, her fingers tapping the screen to reveal a federal order. "Overruled. Chief Justice Reynolds called this in. You've got no grounds, and I've got jurisdiction. Step aside." Decker's jaw tightened, his bulk shifting as if he might lunge, but Ortiz's stare pinned him in place, a predator sizing up prey. "Now," she added, her tone a whip crack, and the cops parted, grudgingly, their power slipping through their fingers. Like sand. Elias limped out of the room, Ortiz at his side, the precinct's hum fading behind them as they moved toward the exit. The air felt lighter, the weight of the cell lifting, but Holt's smirk lingered, a promise of vengeance unspoken but clear. "Pending charges," he'd said, and Elias knew they wouldn't stop. As they reached the front desk, Ortiz handed him a card, her voice low. "This isn't over, stay sharp." Elias nodded, pocketing it, his mind already racing. He'd won this round, tasted freedom's edge, but the system wasn't done with him yet. Outside, the curfew's shadow loomed, Malik's fight stifled, and Holt and Decker's rage simmered, ready to boil over. The burner was gone, smashed, but the call had landed, shaking the precinct's foundation. Elias stepped into the hall, his bruised body aching, his spirit unbroken. They'd tried to crush him, frame him, silence him, but he'd slipped their grasp. For now. What came next wouldn't be a beating, but a war. And Elias Jackson was ready to fight it with everything he had. Dawn broke over San Diego, painting the precinct's front steps in streaks of gold and pink, the air crisp with the promise of a new day. Elias Jackson limped out of the building, his bruised ribs screaming with each step, his torn coat hanging loose over his shoulders, the blood on his face now a dark smear against his ashen skin. DOJ agent Carla Ortiz walked beside him, her badge catching the light, her jaw tight as she scanned the crowd swelling beyond the barricades. Malik Jackson broke through the throng, his lean frame trembling with relief as he rushed forward, dreadlocks bouncing, his pepper spray-stained shirt a badge of his own battle. "Granddad!" he shouted, voice cracking as he threw his arms around Elias, careful not to squeeze too hard. Elias gripped his grandson's shoulder, grey eyes softening for a moment, a rare crack in his stoic armor. The crowd roared, a sea of raised fists and homemade signs. "Justice lives," scrawled in bold red across cardboard. News crews swarmed like flies, their cameras zooming in, reporters jostling for position as mics thrust toward Elias. "Justice, Jackson, what happened?" "In there," one yelled, her voice sharp over the din. He straightened, wincing as his ribs protested, and faced them, his voice steady despite the pain. "They thought they could bury me because of my skin. They were wrong." The words landed like a thunderclap, the crowd erupting in cheers, phones flashing as the moment went live across the nation. For a fleeting heartbeat, it felt like victory, a crack in the wall of hate that had caged him all night. Elias stood tall, a battered titan, the weight of the precinct lifting as the sun climbed higher, but freedom's taste soured fast. Hours later, Elias sat in his modest home in Logan Heights, a quiet neighborhood of weathered bungalows and sagging porches, the walls lined with photos of his late wife, Naomi, her smile frozen in sepia tones. He sipped water from a chipped glass, his hands trembling slightly, the ache in his bones a dull roar. Malik paced the living room, phone in hand, scrolling through messages of support, his energy a restless storm. "We've got the world watching now, Granddad," he said, voice buzzing with hope. "They can't touch us?" Elias nodded, a faint smile tugging at his split lip, but the peace shattered when the front door splintered open with a deafening crash. Officers Travis Holt and Miles Decker stormed in, badges glinting, guns drawn, their faces twisted with a fury that hadn't died with his release. "Search warrant!" Holt barked, waving a paper that reeked of fresh ink, his wiry frame vibrating with spite as he shoved Elias back into his chair. Decker lumbered behind, his broad shoulders knocking a framed picture of Naomi to the floor, the glass shattering into a spiderweb of cracks. "Anonymous tip says you've got stolen goods," Decker growled, his voice thick with menace as he ripped cushions from the couch, tossing them like trash. Malik lunged forward, fists clenched, but Holt spun, slamming him against the wall, the barrel of his gun inches from Malik's face. "Move again, punk, and you're done," Holt hissed, his pale eyes wild with hate. Elias stood, ribs protesting, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "This is my home. You've got no right." Decker laughed, a guttural bellow. As he kicked over a table, Naomi's heirloom vase exploding into shards. "Rights? You don't get those, old man." They tore through the house, smashing memories, leaving a trail of ruin, their boots grinding glass into the hardwood as they claimed their revenge. The assault didn't stop there. By noon, a doctored video hit the internet, grainy footage of Elias outside the precinct, his release twisted into a lie. The clip, spliced by Holt's hand, showed him lunging at Ortiz, fists raised, a fabricated resist arrest moment that never happened. It spread like wildfire, news channels looping it with grim headlines, "Freed suspect attacks federal." "Agent!" Comments flooded in, venomous and sharp. "Should have kept him locked up." Typical thug behavior, the racial slurs piling up like filth in a gutter. Malik stared at his phone, his face paling as he refreshed the feed, the tide of support turning to a wave of hate. "They flipped it," he whispered, voice hollow as he showed Elias the screen. The old man's jaw tightened, his grey eyes narrowing as he watched his name dragged through the mud. Hours earlier, he'd been a hero. Now he was a villain again, the system's claws sinking deeper. Mayor Harold Vance seized the moment, his pudgy face filling TV screens as he stood at City Hall, his tie crisp, his smile a mask of concern. "This video proves we're dealing with a dangerous element," he said, voice oily with authority. "I'm banning all protests citywide, effective immediately. We won't tolerate violence." The crowd outside his office hissed, but police lines tightened, batons gleaming. enforcing the decree with brutal efficiency. Black neighborhoods locked down, streets eerily silent, the curfew's grip choking out the fight Malik had sparked. Elias sat amid the wreckage of his home, the air thick with dust and the sting of betrayal, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the broken vase, Naomi's last gift to him. Malik knelt beside him, picking up shards with trembling fingers, his voice low. "We can fight this, Granddad. My people online, they're already debunking it." Sure enough, his followers rallied, tech-savvy allies dissecting the video frame by frame, exposing the edits, the timestamp glitches, the shadows that didn't match. Tweets flew, fake as hell. Cops framed him again, the truth clawing its way back into the light. By evening, a local station ran a counter-report. Video evidence doctored, experts say, and the pendulum swung, outrage reigniting. As the lie unraveled, Elias nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes as Malik's work paid off, but the mayor's ban held firm, a steel wall crushing their momentum. "They'll hit harder now," Elias said, his voice a quiet rumble, his gaze drifting to the shattered door. Holt and Decker had lost the precinct battle, but they'd struck back with a vengeance, turning his sanctuary to rubble, his freedom to ash. The crowd's cheers faded in his ears, replaced by the echo of boots on his floor, the weight of a war far from won. Elias had slipped their grasp again, but the cost was mounting, and the next blow would be a beast he couldn't outrun. Drop a 1 in the comments if you're furious at Holt and Decker trashing Elias's home just to spite him, or a 2 if you think Malik's got the grit to take this fight to the end. Hit that like button if you're cheering for Elias to rise from these ashes, and subscribe because tomorrow's chapter will blow your mind. Now picture this, with the mayor's ban choking the streets and the cops' rage boiling over, what kind of hell will they unleash on Elias next to keep him down? Elias Jackson sat in the wreckage of his Logan Heights home, the air thick with the dust of shattered memories, the jagged edges of Naomi's broken vase glinting under the dim glow of a single lamp Malik had salvaged from the chaos. His bruised hands rested on the armrests of his old oak chair, his ribs a throbbing cage around his lungs, each breath a sharp reminder of the precinct's beating. The torn coat hung over his shoulders like a tattered flag, bloodstains crusting the fabric where Holt's fists had landed. Malik paced the splintered floorboards, his phone clutched tight, his dreadlocks swaying as he scrolled through updates, his voice a low simmer of defiance. "We've got 'em on the ropes, Granddad. That video's toast and people are pissed." Elias nodded, his grey eyes steady despite the ache, a flicker of pride cutting through the exhaustion. The living room's walls, once warm with family photos, now bore gashes from Decker's rampage, a battlefield scarred by hate. Outside, the curfew's silence smothered the streets, San Diego's black neighborhoods locked under Mayor Vance's iron decree, the distant wail of sirens a constant threat. Elias had tasted freedom that morning, felt the crowd's roar, but it was a hollow echo now, drowned by the ruin around him. He'd won a battle, but the war was clawing back with teeth bared. 2 days later, Elias stood in a San Diego courtroom, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and nervous sweat, the high ceiling looming like a judgment waiting to fall. His suit was crisp, borrowed from Malik's closet, a stark contrast to the bruises still blooming across his jaw. He faced Judge Aisha Carter, a 50-year-old black woman with a gaze sharp as a scalpel, her robes flowing as she leaned forward. From the bench, Elias's legal team, a trio of pro bono attorneys rallied by Malik's network, had filed an emergency suit against the precinct, demanding a restraining order against officers Travis Holt and Miles Decker. The courtroom buzzed with reporters, their pens scratching furiously, cameras barred but the tension palpable. "This is an outrage," Aisha said, her voice a steady drumbeat, her dark eyes piercing the precinct's lawyer, a sweaty white man, in a cheap suit who shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Jackson, a retired Supreme Court justice, was assaulted, framed and harassed in his own home. I'm granting the restraining order, effective immediately." She slammed her gavel, the sound a crack of thunder, and Elias exhaled, a weight lifting as the crowd outside the courthouse cheered, their muffled voices seeping through the walls. Holt and Decker sat in the back, summoned as witnesses, their faces stormy, Holt's wiry frame rigid, Decker's bulk slouched but tense. Aisha glared at them, her words cutting deep. "Your actions disgrace the badge. Stay 500 feet from Mr. Jackson, or you'll answer to me." Elias met their stares, his grey eyes unyielding, victory a bitter balm on his wounds. He'd won again, pushed the system to bend. But the air crackled with something darker, a storm brewing in their silence. The retaliation came swift and silent. Mayor Harold Vance, his office a fortress of glass and steel downtown, sat behind a mahogany desk, his pudgy fingers drumming as he glared at a grainy photo of Elias on his phone. His ban had stifled the protests, but the restraining order stung, a crack in his control. He picked up a burner, his voice a low hiss as he dialed. "Get me dirt on Jackson, anything, make it stick." Within hours, a corrupt PI named Victor Crane, a gaunt man with a hawk's nose and a rap sheet scrubbed clean by Vance's influence, was tailing Elias, his black sedan lurking outside the house like a vulture circling carrion. Crane snapped. Photos through the cracked windows, dug through trash for receipts, hacked into old court records, anything to twist into a weapon. That night, Malik stepped outside to check the mail, the curfew's quiet broken by a sudden roar. His beat-up sedan erupted in flames, an orange inferno swallowing the driveway, the stench of gasoline thick as glass, shattered from the heat. Elias rushed out, his ribs protesting, pulling Malik back as the fire licked the sky. Neighbors peering from behind curtains, too scared to intervene. "They're coming for us," Malik whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at the blaze, his hands shaking with rage. Elias's jaw tightened, his grey eyes reflecting the flames, knowing this was Vance's first shot across the bow. The trap snapped shut the next afternoon. Elias walked through a grocery store 3 blocks from home, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, his cart half full with bread and canned soup, a mundane errand after days of chaos. He moved, slow, favouring his left side, his mind on Malik's torched car when Holt and Decker appeared, off-duty but reeking of intent. Holt's wiry frame blocked the aisle, his civilian jacket tight over his shoulders, while Decker loomed behind, his broad hands flexing in a faded hoodie. "Fancy meeting you here, old man," Holt said, his sneer a blade's edge as he stepped closer, breaching the restraining order with a smirk. Before Elias could react, Decker shoved a cold metal object into his cart, a snub-nosed pistol. Glinting under the lights, then backed off, his grin wide as a jackal's. "Help, he's got a gun," Holt shouted, his voice piercing the store, shoppers scattering as a manager dialed 911. Elias froze, his heart pounding as he saw the setup, his hands raising instinctively. "That's not mine," he said, voice steady but urgent. But the damage was done. 2 uniformed cops burst in, guns drawn, their faces hard as they tackled Elias to the linoleum, his ribs cracking under their weight, the pistol now in his bag, a felon's mark planted with surgical precision. "Felon in possession," Holt muttered to Decker as they slipped away, their laughter a fading echo. The restraining order a joke they'd shredded with glee. Elias sat in a squad car, wrists cuffed again, the grocery store fading in the rear view as sirens wailed, his breath shallow from the pain. He'd won in court, tasted justice's edge, but Holt and Decker had struck back harder, turning a mundane trip into a nightmare. Hours later, a bystander's shaky video hit the web. Malik's network at work again, showing Decker's plant, the guns sliding into the cart, Holt's staged panic. "Set up!" the caption screamed, and the clip spread, outrage flaring as the truth clawed free. Elias was released by nightfall. The charges dropped under public pressure, but the victory was ash in his mouth. He limped back home, Malik at his side, the air heavy with defeat. The mayor's voice crackled on TV as they entered, Vance's pudgy face filling the screen, his tone grave. "Due to escalating threats, I'm declaring martial law in San Diego. Curfews extended, patrols doubled. We'll keep order." His eyes gleamed, a tyrant's promise, and the city locked down tighter, black neighborhoods caged, military Humvees rolling through streets once alive with protest. Elias sank into his chair, the broken vase at his feet, his grey eyes narrowing as he stared at the screen. Holt and Decker had lost the battle, but Vance had escalated the war, his PI lurking, his cops emboldened. the system's jaws closing. Around them, freedom had slipped through Elias's fingers again, replaced by a chokehold he couldn't break, not yet. Elias Jackson sat in a stark cell at the San Diego County Jail, the orange jumpsuit rough against his bruised skin, the air heavy with the stench of bleach and despair. His grey hair was matted, his ribs a throbbing ache from the grocery store. Takedown, the cold concrete bench beneath him biting into his bones. The pistol planted by officers Travis Holt and Miles Decker had landed him here, a felon's mark pinned on him with vicious precision, but his grey eyes burned with a defiance that refused to flicker. The cell's steel bars glinted under flickering lights, the distant clang of doors and shouts of inmates a grim symphony in the night. Malik had worked fast, his network of activists and tech allies dissecting the bystanders' video, proving the gun was a setup, the frame-up a lie. By morning, the clip had millions of views, hashtags like Free Elias Now blazing across screens, and the pressure hit like a tidal wave. Elias's legal team stormed the jail with a federal writ, their voices sharp as they faced a sweating warden, his hands trembling as he signed the release papers. At noon, Elias walked out, the heavy gate groaning open, his borrowed suit wrinkled but his posture unbowed. Malik waited at the curb, his lean frame tense, dreadlocks swinging as he rushed forward, gripping Elias's arm with a shaky grin. "We did it, Grandad," he said, voice raw with triumph as a crowd of supporters erupted, their cheers shaking the asphalt, signs waving high with "Justice Prevails" in bold black ink. Elias nodded, his split lip twitching into a faint smile, the taste of freedom sharp against the jail's bitter aftertaste. For a moment, the sun felt warm, the weight of cuffs gone, victory a tangible pulse in the air. But the reprieve was a mirage. That afternoon, Mayor Harold Vance sat in his glass-walled office, his pudgy fingers drumming a furious rhythm on his desk. His face flushed red as he watched the jail release on a muted TV. Elias's win was a slap. To his control, the restraining order a bruise on his ego and the viral truth a torch to his plans. He grabbed his phone, his voice a venomous snarl as he dialed his press secretary. "Spin this now," he hissed, his eyes narrowing at the screen. "He's no hero. He's a threat." By evening, a smear campaign flooded the airwaves. Slick ads and news segments branding Elias a gang leader, forged documents linking him to cartels surfacing online, grainy photos of him doctored with shadowy figures in dark alleys. "Retired justice or criminal mastermind," screamed headlines, the lies slick as oil seeping into public doubt. Social media split, some crying "frame up," while others spat, "lock him up for good," the racial venom thick in every comment thread. Elias sat in his trashed living room, the TV flickering with Vance's face, his grey eyes narrowing as Malik scrolled through the hate on his phone, his voice tight. "They're burying us again, Grandad." The crowd's cheers faded in Elias's ears, replaced by the hiss of a city turning against him, the system's jaws snapping shut with renewed hunger. The Retaliation roared into life that night. Holt and Decker, off-duty but fueled by rage, gathered a vigilante mob, a dozen white men in hoodies and trucker hats, their eyes gleaming with hate under the cover of martial law's chaos. They rolled up to Elias's church, Mount Zion Baptist, a modest brick building 2 miles from his home, its steeple a quiet beacon in the curfew's gloom. Elias had worshipped there for 40 years, its pews a sanctuary from the world's storms, but now it was a target. Decker tossed a Molotov cocktail through a stained-glass window, the crash of shattering color swallowed by a whoosh of flame, while Holt sprayed gang scum across the walls in dripping red paint. The mob cheered, bottles and bricks flying as the fire spread, licking up hymnals and wooden beams, the air thick with smoke and gasoline fumes. "This is for your justice, old man," Holt shouted, his wiry frame silhouetted against the blaze. His sneer a twisted mask as Decker laughed, kicking over a donation box, coins scattering into the inferno. Neighbors watched from behind locked doors, phones trembling as they recorded, too terrified to intervene under Vance's iron grip. The church burned, a sacred heart gutted, its steeple collapsing in a shower of sparks. The roar of destruction a war cry from men who wouldn't let Elias's win stand. Elias stood a block away, Pulled from his home by the glow on the horizon, Malik at his side, their faces lit by the fire's wrath. His chest tightened, not from his ribs, but from the sight of Mount Zion crumbling, decades of prayers and songs reduced to ash. "They took everything," he whispered, voice a low rumble, his grey eyes glistening with something rare, grief cutting through his steel. Malik clenched his fists, his breath hitching as he pulled out his phone, hands shaking, as he dialed. His tech-savvy friend Jaden, a wiry 20-something with a laptop always close, answered fast. "I'm on it," Jaden said, voice clipped as he hacked into Victor Crane's files, the mayor's PI who'd trailed Elias. Within hours, Jaden cracked it, unearthing emails tying Vance to the smear, payments to Holt and Decker, plans to neutralize the threat. Malik posted it online, the truth blazing brighter than the church's flames. Mayor's hit squad exposed, trending as the world saw the rot. But the victory was hollow. Elias stared at the smouldering ruins, the cross atop, the steeple a charred skeleton against the sky, his sanctuary gone. "We hit back," Malik said, voice fierce. But Elias's silence was heavy, the cost sinking deep. Holt and Decker had lost the frame-up, but they'd burned his soul, and Vance's hand pulled the strings, tightening the trap around them both. Type a 1 in the comments if you're gutted by Holt and Decker torching Elias's church just to spite him, or a 2 if you're betting Malik's hack will finally bury the mayor. Smash that like button if you're standing with Elias through this inferno, and subscribe because tomorrow's showdown will leave you reeling. Now imagine this, with the church in ashes and Vance's plot exposed, will Elias's next move topple the kingpin, or has he just painted a bigger target on his back? The ruins of Mount Zion Baptist Church smoldered under a grey San Diego sky, tendrils of smoke curling into the air like the ghosts of lost prayers, the charred skeleton of the steeple jutting up from the ashes like a broken promise. Elias Jackson stood at the edge of the wreckage, his bruised hands shoved deep into the pockets of his torn coat, the acrid sting of burnt wood biting his lungs with each shallow breath. His grey eyes traced the devastation, the melted pews and shattered windows, a wound carved into his soul, decades of solace reduced to cinders by Holt and Decker's hate. Malik stood beside him, his lean frame rigid, dreadlocks swaying as a breeze carried embers past, his phone clutched tight, its screen glowing with Jaden's hacked files exposing Mayor Vance's plot. The air buzzed with tension, the curfews, silence broken by the distant hum of military Humvees patrolling the locked-down streets, martial law's grip tightening around the city's throat. Elias's ribs ached, a dull throb from the jail's beating, but his spirit burned hotter than the flames that had gutted his church. He'd won battles, slipped their traps, but this loss cut deeper, a personal blow from men who wouldn't rest until he was dust. "We can't let this stand," Malik said, voice low and fierce, his eyes locked on the ruins. Elias nodded, his jaw tightening, knowing the war had shifted, the stakes climbing to a brutal new peak. That afternoon, Elias faced a swarm of reporters outside the church, their mics thrust forward like spears, the air thick with the click of cameras and the murmur of urgent questions. He stood tall despite the pain, his borrowed suit creased but his posture unyielding. Malik at his side holding up his phone, Jaden's files projected on a makeshift screen. "This is the truth," Elias said, his voice a steady roar cutting. Through the chaos, each word a hammer strike. "Mayor Vance paid officers Holt and Decker to frame me, to burn this church, to silence us. Here's the proof." He gestured to the screen, emails and bank records glowing in stark black and white. Vance's signature a damning thread tying him to the vigilante mob. The crowd gasped, reporters scribbling furiously as Malik scrolled, his voice sharp as he narrated. $10,000 to Holt, 5 to Decker, orders to neutralize Jackson. This ain't justice, it's a hit. The story exploded, news vans beaming it live, the DOJ scrambling into action as Chief Justice Olivia Reynolds pushed an emergency probe from D.C. By evening, the precinct buckled, federal agents storming in with warrants, suspending Holt and Decker on the spot, their badges yanked as they glared from the sidelines. Holt's wiry frame trembling with rage, Decker's bulk slouched but seething. Elias watched the coverage from his trashed living room, the TV flickering with images of agents cuffing precinct brass, his grey eyes glinting with a hard-won edge. He'd struck back, landed a blow that shook the system, but the air crackled. With a darker promise, a storm brewing beyond the screen. Vance didn't flinch. Holed up in his downtown fortress, his pudgy face flushed with fury, he slammed a fist on his desk, the wood groaning under the blow as he watched his empire crack. The suspensions were a wound, the probe a blade. But he'd built his power on deeper rot and he wasn't done. He grabbed a secure line, his voice a guttural snarl as he dialed a shadow contact. Jackson's a public threat. $50,000 bounty, dead or alive. Spread it wide. Within hours, the word hit the streets, whispered in dive bars and back alleys, a price on Elias's head that turned every desperate soul into a hunter. By midnight, Vance took the airwaves, his suit pristine, his smile a mask of calm as he faced the city. "Elias Jackson's a danger to San Diego," he said, voice smooth as oil, his eyes cold. His actions incited this chaos. Endangered lives. We're taking extreme measures to protect our citizens. Martial law tightened, checkpoints multiplying, black neighborhoods caged in razor wire, the mayor's decree a death sentence cloaked as order. Elias and Malik watched from home, the TV's glow casting long shadows across the shattered floor, the bounty's weight sinking into their bones. "They're hunting us now," Malik said, voice tight as he checked the locks, his hands trembling. Elias nodded, his grey eyes narrowing, knowing freedom had turned to a noose. The trap sprang at dawn. Decker, rogue and rabid, tracked Elias through Crane's intel, the PI's tail never far behind. He cornered Malik outside a friend's apartment, a quiet spot 3 miles from Logan Heights, the curfew's gloom hiding his approach. Decker's broad frame loomed from the shadows, a silenced pistol in his meaty hand, his hoodie soaked with sweat as he grabbed Malik by the throat, slamming him against a brick wall. "Where's the old man?" he growled, his breath hot with rage, the gun pressed to Malik's temple. "Tell me or you're dead!" Malik choked, his lean body thrashing, but his eyes blazed with defiance. "You'll never win!" he spat, voice ragged as he twisted, kicking at Decker's shin. The cop snarled, pistol whipping him across the jaw, blood spraying as Malik crumpled, his dreadlocks splaying on the pavement. Decker dragged him into a van, tires screeching as he peeled off, a message crackling over a burner to Elias. "Surrender by noon, or the kid's brains paint the docks." Elias got the call at home, his hand steady as he gripped the receiver, grey eyes icing over with a fury he hadn't felt since the church burned. He'd won the probe, but Decker had turned it personal, a dagger to his heart. Elias didn't hesitate. He met DOJ agent Carla Ortiz at a gas station, her sedan idling in the dawn's haze, her badge tucked away as she handed him a wire. "We'll sting him," she said, voice clipped, her brown eyes hard with resolve. Elias wired up, his torn coat swapped for a plain jacket, his ribs screaming as he climbed into her car. They tracked Decker to an abandoned pier, the same spot where this nightmare began, the salty air thick with menace as waves crashed below. Elias stepped out, hands raised, his voice steady as he called into the gloom. "I'm here." "Let him go," Decker emerged, Malik staggering ahead, a gun to his back, blood trickling from his split lip. "Smart move, old man," Decker sneered, his bulk shifting as he shoved Malik forward. Ortiz's team sprang from the shadows, feds in black vests swarming, guns drawn as they tackled Decker, the wire catching every word. Malik stumbled into Elias's arms, gasping, while Decker roared, thrashing against cuffs, his escape cut short. Elias held his grandson tight, grey eyes locked on Decker's glare, victory bitter on his tongue. He'd saved Malik, outsmarted the beast, but the pier's wind carried a chill, a whisper of worse to come. Decker spat as they dragged him away, his voice a venomous vow. "This ain't over, Jackson. You're a dead man." Elias stood firm, the bounty still alive, Vance's shadow looming, the war exploding beyond the precinct's walls. Rain pounded the roof of a Safehouse tucked deep in rural California, 30 miles north of San Diego. The night a shroud of wet darkness wrapping the clapboard shack in isolation. Elias Jackson sat by a cracked window, his grey eyes scanning the muddy fields beyond, the borrowed jacket tight over his bruised shoulders, his ribs a dull ache beneath the fabric. Malik slumped on a sagging couch nearby, his lean frame bruised from Decker's pistol whipping, dreadlocks matted with dried blood, his phone dark after the sting at the pier. The Safehouse was a DOJ lifeline, arranged by Agent Carla Ortiz after Decker's arrest. Its walls paper-thin, but its location a secret from Vance's manhunt. Martial law had turned San Diego into a cage, the $50,000 bounty on Elias's head, a siren call to every thug and cop loyal to the mayor's. Rot. The air hummed with tension, the patter of rain a restless drumbeat as Elias gripped a burner phone Ortiz had slipped him, its weight a fragile shield against the storm closing in. "We're safe here," Malik said, voice hoarse as he rubbed. His swollen jaw, but Elias's silence was heavy, his gaze fixed on the horizon, knowing safety was a lie they couldn't afford to believe. Decker's vow echoed in his ears. "You're a dead man," a promise that lingered like the stench of smoke from Mount Zion's ashes. Back in San Diego, the DOJ moved fast, their probes slicing through the precinct's corruption like a blade. Through rot. By noon, federal agents raided City Hall, their boots echoing on marble floors as they hauled out boxes of files, Mayor Vance's allies cuffed and sweating under the glare of news cameras. Chief Justice Olivia Reynolds pushed from D.C., her voice a steel whip as she briefed the Attorney General, demanding Holt's arrest to match Decker's. A federal judge, a stern woman with silver hair, signed the warrant, her pen a guillotine, dropping on Holt's neck. Agents stormed his apartment, finding it empty. His wiry frame vanished into the city's underbelly, a ghost fueled by rage. Decker sat in a holding cell, his broad hands cuffed, his sneer unbroken as he glared at the walls, but the hunt for Elias burned hotter, Vance's bounty a wildfire spreading beyond the precinct's fall. Elias watched the updates on a grainy TV in the Safehouse, the screen flickering with images of feds tearing through San Diego, his gray eyes narrowing as Malik muttered, "They're cleaning house, Granddad." It was a win, a crack in the system's armor, but the rain outside roared louder, a warning of the chaos still hunting them. The storm broke at midnight. Decker's escape had been a whisper, a guard bribed with Vance's dirty cash, his cell door swinging open as he slipped into the night. He rallied a white supremacist militia, a pack of 30 men in camo gear, their eyes hollow with hate, their arsenal stocked with rifles and Molotov cocktails. They tracked Elias through Crane's last report, the PI's sedan tailing the Safehouse's dirt road days earlier, its tires leaving faint ruts in the mud. The militia rolled up in battered trucks, headlights off, the rain masking their rumble as they surrounded the shack. Elias caught the glint of movement through the window, his pulse spiking as he shook Malik awake. "They're here," he whispered, voice low and urgent, shoving the burner into his grandson's hand. "Call Ortiz." Malik dialed, his breath shallow as the line rang, but before Carla could answer, a Molotov crashed through the glass, flames erupting across the floor in a roar of heat and light. The shack shuddered, wood splintering as more bottles flew, fire licking up the walls, smoke choking the air. Elias grabbed Malik, pulling him low as bullets punched through the thin planks. The militia's war cry a guttural howl outside. "Burn him out!" Decker bellowed, his bulk a shadow in the rain, his pistol raised as he fired into the blaze. Elias crawled, ribs screaming, his grey eyes darting for an exit, the heat searing his skin as the roof groaned, threatening to collapse. Malik kicked a back door open, the rain a cold slap as they stumbled into the mud, flames chasing them into the night. The militia closed in, boots splashing, their shouts a wall of hate as Elias and Malik ran, the Safehouse a pyre lighting the fields behind them. Decker spotted them, his roar cutting through the storm as he charged, a rifle in his hands, his hoodie soaked black with rain and rage. "You're mine, Jackson," he yelled, firing wild, a bullet grazing Elias's arm, blood blooming hot against his sleeve. Malik shoved him behind a tree, his lean frame trembling as he dialed Ortiz again, her voice crackling through. "Hold on, we're 10 minutes out," she shouted. But 10 minutes was a lifetime. The militia fanned out, their flashlights slicing the dark, Molotovs sparking in their fists as they hunted. Elias pressed a hand to his wound, his breath ragged, his grey eyes locking on Malik's. "Stay sharp," he rasped, knowing they couldn't outrun this. Then Decker struck, a bear charging from the shadows, his meaty arm wrapping Elias's throat, dragging him back as Malik lunged, only to be clubbed down by a militiaman's rifle butt. Elias choked, knees buckling, his vision blurring as Decker hissed, "Time to end this." The militia closed in, ropes in hand, their laughter a sick echo of history's worst ghosts. Malik hit the mud, blood streaming from his temple, his phone. Lost in the chaos as Elias vanished into the militia's grip, Decker's boots splashing away. Ortiz's task force arrived too late, tires screeching as feds spilled from vans, guns drawn, their shouts swallowed by the rain. They found Malik crawling, gasping, his voice a broken plea. "They took him!" he cried, pointing into the dark as the Safehouse burned to its frame, embers hissing in the downpour. Carla knelt beside him, her brown eyes blazing as she radioed. For backup, her voice tight. "We'll find him." Malik staggered up, his lean body shaking but his resolve iron, dialing Jaden from a spare burner Ortiz tossed him. "Track Decker," he said, voice raw as he wiped blood from his face. Elias was gone, a prisoner of hate, his near victory at the pier erased by this ambush. The feds swept the fields, but the militia had melted into the night. Decker's vow, a living curse. Malik clutched the burner, his grey eyes mirroring his grandfather's steel, knowing the war had hit its bloodiest peak, and Elias's fate hung on a thread they couldn't see. Drop a 1 in the comments if you're raging at Decker's militia, turning this into a full-on war, or a 2 if you think Malik's got the fire to pull Elias back from the brink. Hit that like button if you're gripping your seat for Elias's fight, and subscribe because tomorrow's twist will shred your nerves. Now picture this, chained in a militia den with Decker's hate boiling over. Can Elias outsmart this nightmare, or is his next breath his last? Elias Jackson hung in a damp basement of a militia compound, 30 miles east of the burning Safehouse, his wrists bound by coarse rope that bit into his bruised skin, his torn jacket soaked with rain and blood from the graze on his arm. The air reeked of mildew and gun oil, the concrete walls slick with moisture, a single bulb swinging overhead casting wild shadows across his weathered face. His grey hair clung to his scalp, his ribs a throbbing cage from the precinct's beating, now worsened by Decker's rough drag through the mud. Officer Miles Decker paced before him, his broad frame a hulking silhouette, his hoodie dripping as he gripped a tablet streaming live to a dark web feed, the red dot blinking as thousands watched. "So you're a lesson now, Jackson," Decker growled, his voice a low rumble, his patchy beard glistening with sweat as he adjusted the camera, zooming in on Elias's blood-streaked face. "World's gonna see what happens when you step out of line." He swung a meaty fist, cracking Elias's jaw, the jolt snapping his head back, blood spitting onto the floor in a wet arc. Elias grunted, his grey eyes narrowing through the pain, his mind racing despite the haze, decades of courtroom battles sharpening his wits. The militia ringed the room, 10 men in camo vests, their rifles slung low, their laughter a jagged chorus. As Decker kicked a metal chair aside, the clang echoing off the walls. Elias dangled, toes brushing the ground, his breath shallow but his spirit unbroken, knowing Malik was out there, fighting to find him. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the rural night a black void pierced by the Safehouse's dying embers miles away. Malik Jackson crawled from the mud, his lean body battered, blood crusting his temple where the militiaman's rifle had struck. His dreadlocks hung heavy, his phone lost, but DOJ agent Carla Ortiz hauled him up, her brown eyes fierce as she pressed a spare burner into his hand. "Call your tech guy," she said, voice clipped, her badge glinting under her jacket as feds swept the wreckage, their flashlights slicing the dark. Malik dialed Jaden, his voice a rasp as he choked out, "Track Decker, they've got Granddad." Jaden's fingers flew across his laptop in a San Diego hideout, hacking cell towers, pinging the burner Decker had used to taunt Elias. "Got a hit," Jaden said, voice tight, relaying coordinates to Ortiz. The task force mobilized, vans roaring. Down muddy roads, their tires kicking up gravel as they raced toward the compound, 30 minutes out. Malik climbed into Ortiz's sedan, his swollen jaw pulsing, his grey eyes mirroring Elias's steel as he gripped the door, every second a knife in his gut. The feds moved fast, but the militia's head start loomed, and Decker's feed flickered. On Jaden's screen, the live torture a grim clock ticking down. Back in the basement, Decker grinned, his broad hand twisting Elias's arm, the rope creaking as he leaned close, breath hot with venom. "You thought you'd win with your little sting," he snarled, slamming a fist into Elias's gut, the air rushing out in a pained wheeze. "Your kid's dead, and you're next." The lie cut deep, but Elias's mind latched onto a faint hum, a wire Ortiz had taped under his collar at the gas station. It's Mike live if the feds were close. He coughed, blood flecking his lips, and rasped, "You're finished, Decker, they've got you." Decker laughed, a bellow shaking his frame, but Elias's grey eyes flicked to a vent, a signal he'd used in courtrooms, subtle but sharp. The militia jeered, one tossing a beer can that clattered near his feet, their voices a wall of hate, but Elias held steady, his words a baited hook. "Check your back door," he said, voice low, and Decker's grin faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his meaty face. Then the compound shook, boots pounding above, as Ortiz's team breached, flashbangs popping in a blinding roar, smoke flooding. The stairs. Malik burst in first, his lean frame a blur as he tackled Decker, the tablet crashing as feds swarmed, rifles barking orders. Elias dropped, ropes cut by a fed's blade, his knees hitting concrete as Malik gripped his arm, gasping. "We've got you." The rescue was chaos, a storm of shouts and gunfire as the militia scattered, some falling under fed bullets, others vanishing into the woods. Elias staggered up, blood dripping from his jaw, his grey eyes locking on Decker as the cop thrashed. Cuffed by Ortiz, his broad frame heaving against steel. "You're done!" Decker roared, spit flying, but the feds dragged him out, the feed cut, the dark web silent. Elias leaned on Malik, rain washing blood from his face as they climbed into a van, the compound a fading shadow in the rear view. He'd survived, outsmarted Decker mid-torture, but the war wasn't over. Mayor Vance, locked in a San Diego cell, awaiting trial, watched the rescue on a contraband phone, his pudgy face twisting as he dialed a loyal cop, his voice a hiss. "Blow the chopper, now." Minutes later, as the task force's helicopter lifted Elias and Malik toward safety, blast ripped the sky, a bomb planted by Vance's man igniting the tail rotor. The chopper spun, a fiery pinwheel crashing into the Pacific, waves swallowing metal in a frothy roar. Feds scrambled, boats racing to the site, but the shore glowed with wreckage, Elias and Malik lost in the chaos. Decker, cuffed in a fed van, grinned as news crackled over the radio. "Chopper down, no survivors." He'd escaped the compound, but his vengeance landed, or so he thought. Hours later, Ortiz pulled Elias from the surf, his grey hair plastered to his skull, his jacket, gone ribs cracked anew as he coughed seawater onto the sand. Malik washed up nearby, alive but battered, his dreadlocks tangled with kelp, his breath a ragged gasp. "We made it," Elias rasped, his grey eyes glinting with steel as Ortiz radioed, "They're alive." But the triumph soured fast. Decker's allies struck again, planting wreckage from the crash, a charred wallet with Elias's ID framing him as the saboteur. By dawn, feds swarmed the beach, their faces hard as they cuffed Elias, Ortiz's protests drowned by protocol. "Suspect in custody," a radio crackled, and Elias sat in a new cell, his hands bound, his grey eyes narrowing as the trap snapped shut. Malik pounded a fed van's wall, voice raw, "It's a lie!" But the frame upheld, Vance's last, claw slashing from behind bars. Elias had survived the crash, beaten Decker's torture, but the system twisted again, caging him as a villain in his own rescue, the war's bloodiest blow yet. Elias Jackson sat in a stark cell at a federal detention center on the outskirts of San Diego. The walls a cold white that swallowed sound, the air sharp with the tang of antiseptic and steel. His wrists ached from fresh cuffs, his soaked clothes, replaced by a grey jumpsuit that hung loose over his bruised frame, his grey hair still damp from the Pacific's grip. The chopper crash lingered in his bones, Ribs cracked anew, a dull throb pulsing where seawater had burned his lungs, but his grey eyes burned with a defiance that refused to dim. The cell's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting his shadow, long and thin across the concrete floor, a solitary figure caged by a lie. Malik's team had worked fast, Jaden's nimble fingers hacking through fed databases, pulling security footage from the beach, cross-referencing timestamps with Decker's planted wreckage. By noon, they'd cracked it, proving the charred wallet was a frame-up. The crash Vance's doing, not Elias's. The evidence hit the web, Jackson innocent, blazing across screens, and the nation roared, protests flaring despite martial law, their chants shaking San Diego's locked streets. Elias's legal team stormed the center, a writ in hand, their voices sharp as they faced a stone-faced warden, his bald head gleaming as he relented under pressure. At dusk, Elias walked free, the gate clanging shut behind him, his borrowed suit crisp against his battered skin. Malik met him, dreadlocks swaying, his lean frame trembling with relief as he gripped Elias's arm, a crowd surging beyond the fence, their cheers a tidal wave. "Justice lives!" painted on banners in bold red. News vans swarmed, cameras flashing as Elias faced them, his voice steady despite the pain. They tried to drown me in lies. Truth pulled me out. The nation hailed him a martyr, his grey eyes a beacon on every screen victory, a fleeting flame in the dark. But the fire of hate burned hotter. That night, Officer Miles Decker, fugitive and feral, watched the release from a dingy motel room 20 miles away, his broad hands clenched around a stolen phone, the screen glowing with Elias's triumph. His hoodie reeked of sweat and mud. His patchy beard matted from days on the run, rage boiling in his gut as Vance's frame-up crumbled. He dialed a militia contact, his voice a guttural snarl. "Take out the judge, pin it on his kind." By midnight, Judge Aisha Carter, the black woman who'd granted Elias's restraining order, stepped from her courthouse office, her robes swapped for a coat, her silver-streaked hair glinting under streetlights. A sniper's bullet tore through. Her chest, fired from a rooftop by a camo-clad militiaman, her body crumpling to the pavement in a pool of blood, her breath a fading gasp. Decker's allies leaked a manifesto online. Black radicals strike back, forged emails tying Elias. To the hit, the lie slick as oil spreading fast. Newsrooms erupted, headlines screaming, "Justice linked to judge's murder." The racial venom thick as protesters clashed with riot cops, martial law's grip tightening. Elias sat in his trashed Logan Heights home, the TV flickering with Aisha's face, his grey eyes narrowing as Malik scrolled the smear, voice tight. "They're killing us twice, Grandad." The crowd's cheers faded, replaced by a city's howl, the system twisting Elias's win into a noose once more. Sigh. Plow landed harder at dawn. Decker's militia struck again, their rage a wildfire unleashed on Malik's world. A bomb detonated outside his apartment, a rented unit 5 miles from Elias's house, the blast a deafening roar that shattered windows and tore through brick. Malik's girlfriend Tasha, a 25-year-old nurse with a quiet smile, had stayed behind to pack, her shift at the hospital hours away. She stood in the kitchen, coffee brewing, when the explosion hit, flames swallowing her in a heartbeat, her scream lost in the inferno. The building collapsed, a smoldering ruin spitting smoke into the sky, neighbors fleeing as sirens wailed. Too late to save her. Malik raced from Elias's side, his lean frame a blur as he reached the scene, falling to his knees in the ash, his voice a raw wail. "Tasha!" he screamed, clawing at rubble, blood streaking his hands as feds cordoned the block, their faces grim. Elias arrived limping, his grey eyes glistening with grief as he pulled Malik back, the boy's sobs shaking his frail frame. "They took her," Malik choked, his dreadlocks matted with soot, his world gutted by Decker's hate. The news pinned, it on Jackson's radicals, the lie a dagger twisting deeper, Vance's shadow stretching from his cell to claim another life. Elias stood amid the wreckage, his hands clenched, the air thick with the stench of charred wood and loss. Tasha's death a wound he couldn't staunch. He rallied a coalition that night, lawyers and activists crowding his living room, their voices sharp as they drafted a suit against the state, a legal hammer to smash Vance's empire. "We'll bury them," Elias said, voice a low thunder, his grey eyes locked on the TV as Decker's manifesto looped, the crowd's rage a distant echo through martial law's cage. The suit filed at dawn, a federal judge fast-tracking it, the nation watching as Elias's name cleared again, the bomb tied to militia hands, not his, but victory slipped away. Decker's men struck in the chaos, a black van screeching up as Elias left the courthouse, militia thugs in masks leaping out, their fists a blur as they tackled him to the ground, his ribs cracking under boots. "You don't win!" one roared, a hood muffling his voice as they dragged Elias inside, tires squealing as they vanished into San Diego's locked streets. Malik shouted, lunging after them, but feds held him back, his lean frame thrashing, voice raw. "Not again!" Elias was gone, abducted in broad daylight. His coalition's triumph a fleeting spark snuffed by Decker's relentless hate, the war's body count climbing, innocence a casualty they couldn't save. Malik sank to the curb, blood from his hands smearing the pavement, his grey eyes mirroring Elias's steel as feds swarmed. Ortiz barking orders into a radio, her brown eyes blazing. "Find him!" she snapped, her badge glinting as she scanned the street, the vans, trail lost in the city's maze. The TV blared nearby, a newsstand screen looping Aisha's murder, Tasha's death, Elias's kidnapping, the nation's outrage drowned by Vance's martial law, Decker's militia a phantom striking from the shadows. Elias had cleared his name, stood tall as a martyr, but Decker had turned triumph to terror, the bomb's echo a grim toll, Tasha's loss a scar on Malik's soul. The coalition's suit hung in the air, a weapon unfired, as Elias vanished into the militia's grip, his grey eyes unseen but unbowed, the system's claws sinking deeper. Malik rose, wiping ash from his face, his voice a vow as he faced Ortiz. "We get him back." The war had hit its breaking point, Elias a prisoner. Again, Decker's hate a tide they couldn't stem, not yet. Elias Jackson knelt in an abandoned warehouse 10 miles from San Diego's heart, his wrists bound with zip ties that cut into his bruised skin, his grey jumpsuit soaked with sweat and blood from the militia's beating outside the courthouse. The air hung thick with the stench of rust and gasoline, the concrete floor cold against his knees, jagged cracked spiderwebbing beneath him. Rusted beams loomed overhead, their shadows swaying under a flickering bulb, the warehouse a hollow shell, echoing with the drip of leaking pipes. Officer Miles Decker paced before him, his broad frame a hulking menace, his hoodie torn from days on the run, his patchy beard matted with grime as he gripped a pistol, its barrel glinting in the dim light. His meaty hands trembled with rage, his pale eyes wild as he barked into a burner phone, streaming live to a dark web feed, the red dot blinking as thousands tuned in. "You're done, Jackson," he snarled, kicking a dented can that clattered across the floor, his voice a guttural roar. "Confess your crimes, or I'll carve it out of you." He waved a crumpled paper, a fake list of charges, gang ties, murders, all lies forged by Vance's militia to bury Elias's name. Elias lifted his head, grey eyes steady despite the blood trickling from his split brow, his ribs a throbbing cage from the crash and beatings. "You've got nothing," he rasped, voice low but cutting, decades of courtroom steel sharpening, his defiance. Decker grinned, a jackal's sneer, and swung the pistol, cracking Elias's cheek, the jolt snapping his head to the side, blood spitting onto the concrete in a wet smear. Decker loomed closer, his breath hot with venom as he grabbed Elias's jaw, forcing his face to the camera. "Say it!" he bellowed, his bulk shaking with fury. "Tell 'em you're a thug, a killer, a nobody." Elias coughed, blood flecking his lips, but his mind raced, latching onto a faint hum, a wire Ortiz had taped under his collar before the chopper lift, its mic live if the feds were near. He'd signaled Malik once at the compound, and now he played the same card, his grey eyes flicking to a rusted vent, a subtle tilt of his head as he spoke. "You're the nobody, Decker," he said, voice steady, a baited hook sinking deep. "They're coming for you." Decker's grin faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his meaty face, but he laughed, a harsh bellow that shook his frame. "Keep dreaming, old man." Elias held his gaze, his lips twitching into a faint smirk, knowing the hum was real, the feds closing in. Outside, Malik crouched in the rain, his lean frame tense, dreadlocks dripping as he whispered into a burner, Jaden's voice crackling back. "Signals live, 5 minutes out." Ortiz's SWAT team rolled silent, vans cutting through the night, their tires hushed on wet asphalt, rifles cocked as they neared the warehouse, the wire's feed guiding them straight to Decker's lair. The standoff snapped at 4 minutes. Decker raised the pistol, pressing it to Elias's temple, his finger twitching on the trigger as he roared, "Last chance, Jackson!" Elias stared down the barrel, unblinking, his grey eyes a storm of resolve. When the warehouse shuddered, doors blasting open in a deafening boom, flashbangs popping in blinding bursts. SWAT stormed in, black vests glinting, their shouts a wall of sound as they swarmed Decker, rifles barking orders. Malik darted through the chaos, his lean body a blur as he cut Elias's zip ties with a scavenged blade, pulling him low as bullets flew, Decker's pistol clattering as a Fed tackled him, his broad frame thrashing against steel cuffs. "No!" Decker roared, spit flying, but the team pinned him, his feed cutting to static, the dark web silent. Elias staggered up, blood dripping from his brow, his grey eyes locking on Decker's glare as the cop was dragged out, his vengeance crushed under SWAT boots. Malik gripped his arm, voice raw. "We got him, Grandad." Elias nodded, ribs screaming. His breath shallow but his spirit unbroken, the warehouse a battlefield won, Decker's reign shattered in a storm of justice. The victory unraveled fast. Mayor Harold Vance, cuffed in a San Diego cell, watched the warehouse raid on a smuggled TV, his pudgy face twisting as Decker fell. His trial loomed, but his reach stretched, a loyalist in the precinct slipping him. A burner. "Start the riot!" he hissed, voice a venomous whisper, his eyes gleaming with a tyrant's last gasp. By noon, San Diego erupted, Vance's allies triggering chaos to free Decker, a mob of militia and rogue cops storming the streets, Molotovs crashing through shop windows, flames swallowing half the city. Black neighborhoods burned first, razor, wire melting under the heat, martial law's cage cracking as rioters clashed with feds, their shouts a war cry echoing through smoke-choked air. Elias and Malik fled the warehouse, Ortiz's van racing them to safety, but the city's roar followed, a tidal wave of hate unleashed by Vance's hand. News choppers buzzed overhead, capturing the inferno, San Diego ablaze, flashing. Across screens, the nation watching in horror as Elias's win turned to ash. Decker's cuffs held, but Vance's gambit tore the city apart, a desperate bid to claw back power from a cell. The final blow struck at dusk. Elias stood on a hill, overlooking the burning skyline, Ortiz's van idling nearby, Malik at his side, their faces lit by the glow of a city in ruins. A militia sniper, hidden in the chaos, took his shot, a bullet ripping through Elias's chest, blood blooming hot against his jumpsuit as he crumpled, his grey eyes widening in shock. Malik screamed, lunging to catch him, his lean hands pressing. The wound, blood seeping through his fingers as Ortiz shouted into her radio, "Man down!" Feds swarmed, rifles sweeping the hill, but the sniper vanished, a ghost in the riot smoke. Elias gasped, his breath a wet rattle, his grey eyes locking on Malik's as he rasped, "Keep fighting." The van peeled out, racing for a hospital, sirens wailing as the city burned below. Decker's arrest a hollow win against Vance's chaos. Elias's blood stained the seat, his life teetering on the edge, the war's cost carved into his flesh. Malik clutched his hand, voice breaking, "You're not done, Grandad." Ortiz floored it, her brown eyes fierce, but the hill faded behind them, the sniper's echo a grim toll, Elias's fate hanging in the balance as San Diego's flames roared, a testament to hate's relentless grip. Elias Jackson lay in a sterile ICU at a San Diego hospital, the beep of machines a steady pulse, cutting through the antiseptic haze, his chest bandaged where the sniper's bullet had torn through, blood seeping into gauze despite the surgeons. Work. His grey hair fanned across the pillow, his bruised face pale under flickering lights, the grey jumpsuit swapped for a thin gown that clung to his frail frame. Malik sat at his bedside, his lean hands clenched, dreadlocks matted with soot. From the riot's chaos, his grey eyes red-rimmed as he watched the monitors, each blip a fragile thread holding his grandfather alive. DOJ agent Carla Ortiz stood by the door, her brown eyes sharp, her badge glinting as she whispered into a radio, coordinating with feds still hunting the sniper. The room hummed with tension, the city's roar muted beyond thick walls, San Diego's. Flames a distant glow through the window. Elias's breath rasped, a wet rattle in his chest, his grey eyes fluttering open to meet Malik's, a faint nod passing between them, a vow unspoken. Surgeons had fought for hours, pulling him from the brink after the hilltop shot. But the news had already spread, a lie born in the chaos. "Justice Jackson dead in riot," screamed headlines, TV screens looping grainy footage of the van speeding. Away pundits mourning a martyr lost to Vance's war. The nation grieved, protests swelling despite martial law, their chants a thunderous echo through locked streets. Unaware, Elias clung to life in secret. The deception was no accident. Ortiz had orchestrated it, her voice low as she briefed Chief Justice Olivia Reynolds from a secure line. The ICU's hum masking her words. "We faked it," she said, her tone clipped, her brown eyes glinting with resolve. The sniper was ours, a plan to take Elias off the board, flush out the militia. The bullet had been a blank, swapped by a Fed sharpshooter loyal to the DOJ. The blood a staged spill from a hidden packet, Elias's collapse a performance to sell the ruse. Olivia exhaled, her steel voice softening with relief. "You've got him safe?" Ortiz nodded, glancing at Elias, his chest rising slow under the bandages, the truth a weapon they'd wielded in the dark. Hours earlier, feds had whisked him from the van to a classified wing, the hospital a fortress under DOJ guard. Malik sworn to silence as they staged the crash's aftermath. News of his death sparked outrage, militia cells surfacing to gloat, their chatter intercepted by Jaden's hacks, exposing hideouts and names. By dawn, raids swept California, feds storming bunkers, cuffing dozens as Decker's network crumbled, their victory dance a trap that snapped shut. Elias rested, his grey eyes closed, the world mourning a ghost who'd outsmarted them all. Faxi, reckoning came at midnight. Elias rose from the ICU, his ribs a dull ache, his grey hair combed back by Malik's trembling hands, his jumpsuit swapped for a black suit Ortiz had smuggled in. He limped into a secret courtroom beneath the federal building, a shadowed chamber lit by dim bulbs, its walls thick with silence. Malik stood at his side, his lean frame steady, dreadlocks pulled tight, his grey eyes fierce as they faced a judge's. Bench flanked by DOJ brass. Officer Miles Decker sat cuffed, his broad frame slouched, his hoodie gone, his patchy beard stark against a pale face drained of fight. Mayor Harold Vance slumped beside him, his pudgy hands bound, his suit wrinkled. From days in a cell, his eyes darting as the gavel fell. Judge Marcus Hale, a stern black man with a voice like gravel, read the charges: civil rights violations, murder, conspiracy. Each word a hammer strike. Elias testified in disguise, a hood shading his face, his voice steady as he recounted the pier arrest, the church fire, Tasha's death, every blow of Vance's war. "They thought they'd bury me," he said, grey eyes piercing Decker's glare. "But justice doesn't die." The evidence piled high, Jaden's files, Ortiz's wire, militia confessions, a mountain no lie could climb. Hale's verdict landed. Life sentences for both, no parole. Their empire's ashes feds led them out. Decker's roar a fading echo, Vance's whimper swallowed by steel doors. San Diego woke to a new dawn, the riots quelled. Martial law lifted as feds rebuilt the precinct under black leadership, Captain Lena Brooks taking the helm, her dark eyes sharp as she swore in a reformed force. Elias emerged alive. The hoax, revealed on live TV, his grey hair glinting under studio lights as he faced the nation, his voice a quiet thunder. "I'm still here," he said, Malik at his side, the crowd's roar shaking the streets. "Justice lives!" Reborn in their chants. The militia's fall rippled, precincts nationwide probed, Vance's shadow fading as the system bent under Elias's weight. But the cost lingered. He retired to a quiet cabin outside the city, his ribs healing slow, his grey eyes haunted by Tasha's loss, Mount Zion's ashes, the blood on his hands from a war he'd won but couldn't unfeel. Malik stayed close, his lean frame a sentinel, his tech skills now guarding their peace, a silent vow to fight on. Elias sat on the porch, the Pacific's breeze cool against his skin, his voice low as he spoke to the wind. "It's not over," he murmured, grey eyes tracing the horizon, knowing hate slept but never died, his vigil a shadow cast long into the future. The cabin's quiet was a stark contrast to San Diego's scars, the city rebuilding from Vance's inferno, Brooks's precinct a beacon in the rubble. Elias's suit against the state had won, millions funneled to civil rights, but the victory was bittersweet, Tasha's absence a hole Malik couldn't fill, Aisha's death a weight Elias carried alone. He walked the woods daily, his limp fading, his grey eyes sharp as he watched the world shift. News of DOJ probes spreading, a domino chain he'd tipped. Malik built a network, activists linked by Jaden's code, a shield against the next storm. Elias sat one evening, a photo of Naomi in hand, her sepia smile a balm on his wounds, his voice a whisper. "We did it, love." The war had ended. Decker and Vance entombed, the militia shattered. But Elias's fight was eternal, a silent guard against hate's return, his grey eyes a lighthouse in the dusk, unyielding to the end. The saga of Elias Jackson unveils profound lessons about resilience, justice, and the enduring fight against systemic racism. First, it teaches that courage under fire can topple even the most entrenched powers. Elias, a retired Supreme Court justice, faced brutal assaults from racist cops and a corrupt mayor, yet his unyielding spirit turned their hate into their downfall. Second, it reveals the strength of community and technology as weapons for truth. Malik's activism and Jaden's hacking exposed lies, proving that collective action can pierce the veil of oppression. Third, the story underscores the cost of victory, with losses like Tasha and Mount Zion haunting Elias, a reminder that justice often demands sacrifice. Fourth, it highlights the power of strategy over brute force, Elias's staged death outsmarted the militia, showing that intellect can outlast violence. Finally, it warns that racism is a hydra, cut one head and another grows, urging vigilance beyond a single win. Elias's retirement isn't an end, but a call to keep fighting, his grey eyes a beacon for future battles. This tale isn't just a triumph. It's a mirror reflecting society's flaws and a map for resisting them. What do you think? Can one person's stand really spark a revolution against hate? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if Elias's fight inspires you. Subscribe for more tales of grit, and share to spread this call for justice. Thanks for joining this journey. May you find strength to face your own storms.